On a frozen January morning in 1970, a small commuter plane lifted off from Cleveland and vanished just 11 minutes later. No distress call, no warning, just a blip on a radar screen that silently disappeared. Hours later, investigators found a gaping hole in the ice of Lake Erie, and beneath it, the shattered remains of Tag Flight 730. 7 bodies were recovered, 2 were missing. And one of them, 48-year-old James Hugh Wilson, seemed to have been erased from existence. What caused the aircraft's violent mid-air breakup? Why did only Wilson and one other passenger vanish without a trace? And why, more than 50 years later, has Lake Erie never returned their bodies? This is the story of a disaster that should have had answers, but instead became one of the most haunting cold cases in American aviation history. The morning of January 28, 1970, began not with chaos, but with an unsettling stillness, a quiet so heavy it felt like the world was holding its breath. Dawn crept slowly across Cleveland's frozen shoreline, casting a pale blue glow over Lake Erie. From above, the lake looked like a sheet of cracked glass, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The kind of morning where nothing should have gone wrong, yet something already felt off, like a tension hanging in the air that no one could name. At Burke Lakefront Airport, the ground crew moved briskly, their footsteps crunching against frost-covered asphalt. Steam rose from their breaths in short, white bursts as they prepared the aircraft for its first run of the day. The small commuter plane, a de Havilland Dove DH-104, tail number N2300H, stood waiting like a metallic silhouette against the icy lake. It was an ordinary sight, but to some, it would later feel like a prelude to tragedy. Inside the tiny terminal, passengers gathered in quiet clusters, the cold pushing them shoulder to shoulder. Among them was James Hugh Wilson, a man who carried himself with a sense of purpose and subtle detachment. His face was calm, his movements deliberate, as if he were a man used to traveling alone. His ticket was tucked neatly into a leather wallet worn from years of use. No one knew that this would be the last time anyone saw him alive. Wilson wasn't the only passenger that morning whose presence seemed marked by the strange weight of coincidence. A second passenger, whose identity would later become another question mark in a long line of mysteries, stood by the window, watching snow flurries drift over the runway. Their expression was unreadable, an air of quiet apprehension clouding their gaze. In the coming hours, this person would vanish so completely that some investigators privately wondered if they had ever boarded the plane at all. But at 7:20 a.m., nothing felt unusual. The flight crew arrived with practiced ease, 2 seasoned pilots chatting lightly as they performed their pre-flight checks. Captain Robert Adams, tall and composed, looked over the aircraft with a seriousness that hinted at deep professionalism. First Officer Michael O'Connor followed beside him, like clipboard in hand, marking off each item on their checklist. Neither man gave any indication that they sensed what was coming. The clearance for departure came at 7:34 a.m. Passengers filed onto the plane, their footsteps echoing in the narrow cabin. The seats were small but comfortable, arranged in tight rows that made the Dove feel more like a private charter than a commercial aircraft. Wilson sat near the middle, gazing out at the thick sheet of ice covering the lake. He seemed absorbed in thought, something he wasn't sharing, something only he knew. As the engines whined to life, the cold seemed to deepen. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and for a moment the aircraft vibrated more than expected, a detail easily dismissed, yet later recounted by a ground crew member who couldn't shake how unusual it felt. The plane rolled toward the end of the runway, its lights blinking against the dim morning sky. At 7:38 a.m., Tag Flight 730 lifted off. The sound of the engines grew distant, swallowed by the vast expanse of frozen air. Inside the cockpit, the pilots held steady, pushing the plane toward its short, familiar route to Detroit. Routine, predictable, safe. But only if everything worked the way it was supposed to. As the aircraft climbed, the landscape below shifted from the city's gray rooftops to the endless white sheet of Lake Erie. Ice floes stretched between cracks like veins, creating a pattern too random to understand, yet too deliberate to ignore. The Dove flew steadily, but something beneath its aluminum skin was already fracturing, something no one on board could see. At 7:41 a.m., a faint vibration pulsed through the fuselage. Not strong enough to alarm the passengers, but noticeable to the pilots. Adams adjusted the throttle, checking gauges, everything appearing normal. O'Connor scanned instruments with practiced rhythm. Nothing suggested mechanical failure. But the vibration returned, this time sharper, shorter, like the faint crack of something giving way. The pilots exchanged a brief glance. Not panic, just suspicion. Air turbulence, they thought. Cold weather stiffness, routine anomalies. They continued monitoring, unaware they were seconds into a chain reaction that had been years in the making. Below, Lake Erie remained silent. The surface reflected the sky like a mirror, undisturbed and deceptively calm. At 7:43 a.m., a fisherman on the distant shoreline noticed something odd. A glint in the sky, a flicker of sunlight reflecting off something tumbling. He barely paid attention, brushing it off as blowing ice. But later he would recall that glint with chilling clarity. Inside the cabin, Wilson leaned slightly forward, sensing a subtle shift in the aircraft's balance. He wasn't afraid, just observant. His life and business had trained him to notice the small things others overlooked. Yet whatever he felt in that moment would remain locked forever in the cold silence of the lake. At 7:46 a.m., the vibration intensified. Now the aircraft began to drift slightly left. The pilots corrected course. Still no alarms, still no obvious cause. But something was ripping itself open from the inside. What the crew didn't know was that years of unseen metal fatigue had been chewing through the right wing's structural joint. A part the size of a man's hand, buried deep within the wing, was nearing its final moment. And once it gave, nothing could save the aircraft. At 7:48 a.m., the Dove shuddered violently. A metallic groan echoed through the cabin. Passengers stiffened, gripping armrests. Then, in less than a second, the sound that would doom them all filled the aircraft. A sharp, catastrophic crack like the snapping of bone magnified 100-fold. The right wing began to fold. The plane lurched hard. Wilson's head struck the seat in front of him. A passenger screamed. The cabin lights flickered. The horizon tilted sharply right as the aircraft spiraled into a deadly roll. In the cockpit, Captain Adams fought the controls with every ounce of strength he had. But the right wing was tearing apart. The engine, now at a violent angle, sliced through the wing's remaining structure like a saw blade. Metal sheared away in a spray of sparks and fragments. At 7:49 a.m., the radar screen at Cleveland's control tower blinked. The icon representing Tag Flight 730 stuttered, flickered, then vanished. No distress call, no warning, no trace. Only the empty, frozen air above Lake Erie, and a silence so sudden it sent a chill through the control room. The controllers stared at the blank screen, waiting for the blip to return. It didn't. Something was terribly wrong, and they knew it. Phones began ringing, alarms activated, supervisors rushed in. Within minutes, emergency teams were dispatched. But out there, beyond the reach of roads or rescue boats, the plane had already met its fate. Several miles out over the ice, a gaping crater had opened in the frozen lake where the fuselage slammed through. Shards of aluminum bobbed around the hole, steam rising from the impact. Beneath that veil of mist, the aircraft lay shattered on the lake floor, its secrets sinking into 80 feet of black, motionless water. 7 bodies would be recovered in the hours to come. But 2, Wilson and the other unnamed passenger, were already gone, swallowed by the lake long before anyone knew where to look. And with their disappearance, a new mystery was born. The first reports of Flight 730's disappearance struck the Cleveland Airport Operations Center like a cold blade through fabric, clean, sudden, and leaving everyone momentarily speechless. At 7:49 a.m., the blip representing the small tag aircraft simply vanished. No erratic altitude drop, no frantic radio call, no sign of mechanical struggle. 1 second, the plane was following its routine flight path toward Detroit. The next, it was erased from the sky as if an invisible hand had swept it off the radar. Controllers double-checked the screens, reset systems, even switched consoles, hoping it was just equipment lag. But every monitor told the same story. The aircraft, with 2 crew members and 7 passengers, including Arthur Wilson, had disappeared into thin air. The timing couldn't have been stranger. Weather conditions were stable, visibility clear, no storm fronts for miles. It wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. As airport protocol demanded, dispatchers attempted communication. They called the plane's frequency once, twice, 3 times, no reply. The The silence grew heavier with each attempt. On the fourth call, a faint hiss of static crackled through, but still no voice. Something was wrong, very wrong. Investigators would later replay the recording dozens of times, trying to extract meaning from the faint distortion, hoping to catch the slightest indication of distress. But all they ever heard was that hollow static, a sound that felt almost deliberate, as if masking something behind it. By 8:10 a.m., the airport launched its emergency alert system. Within minutes, search and rescue teams were mobilized. Helicopters scanned the projected flight corridor. Boats were dispatched along possible water impact zones. Deputies combed the forested patches beneath the aircraft's last recorded coordinates. Yet the deeper they searched, the stranger the situation became. No debris, no fuel slick, no torn metal, no disturbance on the ground. It was as though the aircraft had been lifted straight out of the sky and transported somewhere beyond reach. Meanwhile, state investigators began piecing together the timeline of that morning. Arthur Wilson, a quiet accountant traveling to Detroit for a routine business meeting, had been seen calmly boarding the plane. Witnesses described nothing unusual. No arguments, no suspicious luggage, no passengers in distress. The only odd detail came from a baggage handler who swore he saw someone near the aircraft moments before takeoff. Someone who didn't look like a crew member. When asked to describe him, the handler hesitated, saying only, "He moved like he didn't want to be noticed." The man had been wearing a dark coat, hood up, despite the mild January morning. No one else recalled seeing him. Flight logs from the first 11 minutes revealed nothing abnormal. Altitude, speed, direction, all perfectly aligned. The two pilots, both experienced and known for flawless records, had made no unusual notes. Then came 7:49 a.m., the exact second everything stopped. Flight data ceased transmitting mid-cycle, not at the end of a pulse, as would normally happen with technical failure. It was cut off sharply, an interruption so precise that investigators later speculated it might have been external, like deliberate interference. By midday, a new layer of mystery emerged. A fisherman near Lake Erie reported hearing a loud, deep rumble around the time the plane disappeared, followed by what he described as a long metallic groan like bending steel. But no disturbance had been detected on the lake's surface. His story conflicted with radar data, which placed the last signal miles away from his location. Was he mistaken, or had investigators been searching in the wrong place entirely? As the day progressed, witnesses surfaced with bits of unsettling information. A truck driver claimed he saw a quick flash of light in the sky, like a camera flash, but brighter. Another person said she heard a high-pitched whistle overhead before the sound abruptly stopped. Each account seemed contradictory, fragmented, but none could be ignored, especially not after a farmer reported finding strange scorch marks in his cornfield directly under the projected flight path. The marks formed an irregular oval shape, as though something had briefly pressed down from above. Soil samples were taken immediately. Results would later stun investigators. Back at the operations center, technicians reviewed the radar logs frame by frame. When slowed down, something peculiar appeared in the final recorded second, a faint secondary blip, extremely small, moving at an impossible speed. At first, they assumed it was an artifact, a glitch, but after enhancement, the blip appeared intentional, following a trajectory that intersected directly with Flight 730's path before vanishing simultaneously. No official explanation could account for it. Whatever it was, it moved too fast to be any known aircraft. Even more baffling was a call received by airport security at 8:43 a.m., a call traced to a payphone several miles away. The male voice on the other end was calm, unusually calm. His message was only 6 words long: "Stop searching. You won't find them." Then the line cut. The recording was immediately handed over to the FBI, but the caller was never identified. The timing was chilling. Whoever made that call knew something no one else did. As dusk approached, the search radius expanded drastically. Dozens of volunteers joined the effort, combing forests and lake shores with flashlights. The sky turned orange, then black, but the teams refused to give up. Helicopters continued sweeping through the night. Yet with each passing hour, hope dimmed. Planes do not simply vanish without leaving a trace, unless something or someone ensures they leave none. The following morning brought one final twist that sent the investigation spiraling into deeper confusion. A hunter walking through a wooded ravine discovered a torn scrap of fabric snagged on a branch. It was small, about the size of a glove, but unmistakably part of a pilot's uniform, blue, with tag's insignia barely visible. But the location where it was found was nowhere near the projected crash zone. And there was something else. The cloth smelled faintly of fuel, yet appeared burned around the edges, as if exposed to extreme heat for a few seconds, not a full explosion. The ravine was thoroughly searched. Nothing else was found. Within 48 hours, the case had transformed from a simple aviation disappearance into one of the most puzzling cold cases Ohio had ever encountered. Every piece of evidence contradicted another. Every lead dissolved into uncertainty. And Arthur Wilson, along with the 8 others aboard Flight 730, had become the center of a mystery that stretched far beyond ordinary explanations. But the story was only beginning, because in the days that followed, investigators would uncover something even more disturbing, something that suggested the disappearance might not have been an accident at all, something that hinted at a plan, a motive, and a truth no one was ready to face. The third morning after Flight 730 vanished, the temperatures in Cleveland dropped sharply, as if the entire city were reacting to the tension thickening in the air. Frost clung to every window pane of the investigation center, and for the first time since the disappearance, agents began admitting quietly to each other that they were no longer dealing with a routine aviation incident. Something was wrong at a deeper level, something they couldn't yet name. But the first crack in the ice was about to form, unexpected and electrifying. At 6:14 a.m., just as the sun was rising, a park ranger entered the operations room holding a sealed plastic bag. Inside was a small, metallic object, roughly 2 inches long, warped on one end as though exposed to intense pressure. He'd found it several miles west of the search zone, in a place no one had thought to look, an isolated patch of woodland near a frozen creek. At first glance, it resembled part of an airplane's fuselage, but the alloy wasn't standard tag material. Technicians performed a rapid analysis and discovered something shocking. The metal had been exposed to temperatures far beyond what a normal crash or engine fire could produce. It was the first tangible piece of evidence suggesting an external force, something violent, sudden, and unlike anything expected in a typical accident. The discovery sent a surge of energy through the investigation team. Maps were quickly pulled from walls, search areas were redrawn, and for the first time it seemed the case had direction. But as investigators began shifting their focus closer to the creek, new and conflicting information poured in like a flood. A hiker reported hearing a piercing, rhythmic hum early that same morning, something he insisted was mechanical yet oddly patterned, like a beacon or signal. When asked to imitate the sound, he hesitated, claiming it made him feel weirdly uneasy, as if the tone itself carried something unnatural. That afternoon, another unusual report surfaced. A woman who lived near the edge of the forest stated she'd seen beams of pale blue light flickering between the trees the night before. She described them as moving with purpose, sweeping the woods like searchlights, but behaving too smoothly, too silently to belong to any known aircraft. Investigators initially dismissed her account as nerves. After all, fears often twist into illusions during high-profile disappearances. But when a second witness, an elderly man known in the area for his meticulous nature, claimed he'd seen the same lights, investigators could no longer brush it aside. Something strange was happening in those woods. By now, attention turned toward the ravine where the scrap of pilot uniform had been found. A forensic team combed the area again, this time with heightened urgency. Beneath a patch of disturbed soil, they found a partial boot print, just one, facing north. What made it chilling was its narrow width and the unusual angle of the heel, almost as though the person wearing it had landed rather than stepped. The tread pattern didn't match the standard issue footwear worn by the tag crew. It didn't match any of the passengers either. It was from someone else, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Simultaneously, a breakthrough occurred at the radar analysis lab. The faint secondary blip captured in the final second of the flight had been enhanced using a new filtering algorithm. The movement pattern it revealed was abnormal, an abrupt, hyper-accelerated arc cutting across the screen with impossible precision. One analyst remarked that the trajectory resembled a predatory strike, like something intercepting the plane deliberately. Another argued the signal might have been an artifact from a classified military test, but the military denied conducting any operations in the area. And if it wasn't them, then who? Or what? Before investigators could explore these theories, a chilling message arrived. A small envelope was delivered anonymously to the local police station. Inside was a cassette tape, unmarked except for the date, 2/28/1970, the exact date of the plane's disappearance. When technicians played it, the room fell silent. A distorted voice repeated a single sentence on loop. He knew what he shouldn't. The tone was eerily calm, emotionless. No background noise, no context, just the message, over and over. The phrase immediately raised questions. Question, who was he? Did it refer to one of the passengers, Arthur Wilson, or one of the pilots? Investigators dug deeper into Wilson's background and discovered something unexpected. 2 weeks before the flight, he had attempted to contact a federal office regarding irregularities in his company's financial practices. He'd left a cryptic message with the secretary, stating he believed he was being watched. The secretary never heard from him again. Had he been trying to expose something? Could his business dealings be tied to the disappearance? But just as this new potential motive emerged, another twist derailed the entire theory. A charcoal gray sedan had been spotted idling near the tag hangar the morning of the flight. After reviewing multiple eyewitness accounts, investigators realized something unsettling. The mysterious hooded man the baggage handler had seen matched the description of a person seen entering the same sedan moments before takeoff. A composite sketch was made. Sharp jawline, narrow eyes, high cheekbones. It was circulated widely. No one recognized him, not colleagues, not family members of the passengers, not law enforcement databases. It was as though he had materialized for the sole purpose of being near that aircraft at that exact moment. Then came the most dramatic discovery yet. Late on the fourth night, a search team near the frozen creek noticed something glinting beneath a thin layer of ice. After clearing the frost, they revealed a metallic object embedded just below the surface. When they extracted it, investigators gasped. It was unmistakably part of the aircraft, specifically a fragment of the cockpit's inner frame. But the damage on it didn't match any known crash pattern. The metal showed signs of concave impact, as though struck from outside, not crushed during descent. Even more baffling, microscopic analysis revealed traces of an unknown compound fused to the surface, a material no one could immediately identify. Suddenly, the idea of a simple mechanical malfunction seemed laughable. The pressure on investigators intensified. Media speculation exploded. Some demanded answers. Others whispered wild theories. But inside the investigation center, the team focused on one key question. Why had the search area yielded only scattered, isolated pieces instead of a concentrated crash site? Aircraft don't disintegrate silently across miles without catastrophic noise, fire, or debris fields, unless the destruction wasn't natural, unless it happened in stages. Another chilling detail soon surfaced. A confidential informant contacted detectives with a shocking claim. A group of individuals had been seen collecting samples near the ravine days before the official search reached that spot. Their equipment looked advanced, too advanced for normal field research. When approached, they'd refused to identify themselves and departed immediately in unmarked vehicles. Surveillance in the area confirmed tire tracks matching the description. Meanwhile, the soil samples from the farmer's cornfield returned from the lab. The scorch marks contained traces of ionized particles, the kind produced in high-energy events. Not a regular fire, not engine heat. Something far more intense. Something capable of leaving elliptical burn patterns without destroying surrounding vegetation. Investigators were baffled. Scientists were baffled. It didn't add up. Piece by piece, the case cracked open like ice under growing pressure. The breakthroughs piled quickly, too quickly. It felt almost orchestrated, as though someone had loosened the threads just enough for the team to follow, but not enough to reveal the full picture. Finally, in the late evening of the fifth day, a deputy noticed something unsettling. The cassette tape's background, previously thought silent, contained faint, rhythmic clicking when played through enhanced equipment. The pattern mirrored the mysterious hum the hiker had described, and beneath that, barely audible, was another sound, a faint whooshing like wind moving unnaturally fast. The room fell silent as technicians replayed the enhanced audio again and again. The message, the lights in the forest, the unnatural burn marks, the foreign alloy, the mysterious hooded man, the unidentified metal fragment, it all pointed to something larger than a random aviation tragedy. The ice beneath the investigation had finally cracked wide open, and whatever waited underneath was colder, darker, and far more dangerous than anyone had dared to imagine. From the moment investigators dug into the background of James Hugh Wilson, the quiet accountant seated in row 3 of Flight 730, they sensed something was off. Subtle at first, like a thread pulled too tightly in a tailored suit. His name had appeared on the passenger list without drawing initial suspicion, overshadowed by the chaos of the disappearance. But soon his life, routine on the surface, began revealing fractures that hinted he might be far more than just another victim of a tragic cold case. On paper, Wilson lived a painfully ordinary life. 42 years old, unmarried, modest apartment, same accounting job for nearly a decade. Colleagues described him as polite but distant, meticulous but guarded. He kept to himself, rarely attended office gatherings, and avoided small talk with disarming consistency. The one thing everyone agreed on was his reliability. He never missed a meeting, never arrived late, and never deviated from his predictable routines. And yet, in the weeks before the flight, something had shifted. Subtle changes, easy to overlook, unless you were searching for them. Investigators found that 2 weeks before the disappearance, Wilson had abruptly canceled a series of client meetings. His supervisor said he'd seemed distracted, almost anxious, though he never admitted to anything beyond personal matters. Neighbors recalled seeing him pacing outside his apartment late at night, whispering urgently into the phone, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone to step out of the shadows. One neighbor, an elderly woman with a good memory for faces, insisted she'd seen a dark sedan parked near his building on several evenings, always with a man inside, always watching. When detectives obtained access to Wilson's apartment, the real mystery began to unfold. The living room was tidy, carefully arranged, almost sterile. But inside a locked drawer in his desk lay a stack of documents, financial ledgers, transaction logs, and handwritten notes filled with columns of numbers circled, crossed out, rewritten. Many were tied to his employer, Shaker & Rowe Financial Services. On their own, they meant little, but together they painted a troubling picture. Irregularities in corporate accounts, shell transfers, hidden balances, signs of something criminal. Wilson had been investigating his own company. In the margins of one page, scrawled hastily, was a phrase that sent chills through the room. "They know I found it." Investigators traced the phone numbers he'd called during those late-night conversations. Most were disconnected or unregistered. But one number belonged to a federal office, an office that confirmed Wilson had attempted to contact a financial crimes investigator, leaving only a vague message. "It's urgent. I'm being followed. I can't talk long." The voicemail timestamp was 10 days before his disappearance. No follow-up call was ever made. Why had he chosen that particular morning, January 28th, 1970, to fly to Detroit? And why had he told no one about the trip? Not his boss, not his colleagues, not his neighbors? Even stranger, the ticket had been purchased in cash from a small agency across town. The employee who sold it remembered Wilson clearly. He looked exhausted, agitated, and kept scanning the street outside the window. He did not mention business. He did not mention anyone expecting him. The deeper investigators dug, the more contradictions emerged. His bank statements revealed 2 recent cash withdrawals totaling several $1,000s, out of character for a man known for frugal habits and carefully planned expenses. His passport was missing. And under his bed, wedged behind a suitcase, detectives found a small, locked metal box. The lock was broken easily. Inside were 3 items that raised even more questions. A silver fountain pen engraved with initials that weren't his, a map marked with a precise route ending near Lake Erie, and a small audio reel that contained nothing but several seconds of static. At least, nothing audible to the human ear. When examined under enhanced frequency analysis, the static contained faint pulses, patterns disturbingly similar to the rhythmic hum reported by the hiker near the forest. Had Wilson recorded something, witnessed something, or been warned? Even more unsettling was the discovery from his office computer. Forensic technicians reconstructed fragments of recently deleted files, drafts of letters addressed to someone referred to only as M. The letters were never finished, but one sentence stood out with chilling clarity. If anything happens to me, the truth is in the numbers. But what truth? And who was M? Midway through the investigation, the team received an unexpected lead. A retired analyst who had once worked at Shaker and Rowe anonymously contacted authorities. He claimed the company had been involved in offshore laundering schemes during the late 1960s, illegal transactions masked through subsidiary accounts. If Wilson discovered the scheme, it might have made him a target. The analyst ended the call abruptly, refusing to identify himself. Yet, just as investigators began leaning toward a criminal motive, another layer of the mystery cracked open, one that complicated everything. Wilson had kept a second ledger hidden behind a false panel in his apartment wall. This ledger was unlike the others. Instead of numbers and bank codes, it contained diagrams. Circles, geometric patterns, intersecting lines forming shapes reminiscent of frequency maps or magnetic fields. Some pages were labeled with dates, others with phrases like field distortion, apex shift, and nonlinear movement. None of it resembled anything an accountant should be studying. But the most unnerving detail was a sketch on the final page. A crude drawing of a small aircraft, one that looked unmistakably like Flight 730, surrounded by swirling arcs. Next to it was a short note: "They're watching the skies." When investigators questioned Wilson's colleague and only close friend, Martin Graves, they were shocked by what he revealed. 3 nights before the flight, Wilson had shown up at his home unannounced, pale and trembling. He kept repeating, "I shouldn't have looked. I shouldn't have seen it." Graves asked what he meant, but Wilson refused to explain. He simply said that they were monitoring him and that he needed to leave before it happens. Graves initially assumed his friend was having a nervous breakdown, but now, with the context of the disappearance, every word sounded like a warning no one had listened to. Then came the most explosive piece of the puzzle. Forensic specialists analyzing security footage from the airport finally managed to enhance part of the frame, capturing the hooded man the baggage handler had mentioned. After stabilizing the image, they realized the man wasn't just glancing at the aircraft, he was watching Wilson specifically. His head turned to follow Wilson as he boarded. And in one chilling frame, as Wilson paused at the aircraft stairs, the hooded man raised his hand slightly, as if signaling someone out of frame. The final seconds of the tape showed something even more disturbing. A faint reflection in the airport window behind the man. A second figure. Taller, standing unnaturally still. Investigators enhanced the reflection, expecting a blurry human shape. What they got instead was something wrong, something that didn't match any human proportions. The reflection vanished in the next frame. Every new detail about Wilson traced the same arc. He knew something. Something dangerous. Something that made him a target long before he stepped onto Flight 730. Was he running from the people behind the financial scheme? Or had he uncovered something bigger? Something connected to the strange lights, the scorch marks, the unknown alloy, and the impossible radar blip? As investigators pieced together his final days, one conclusion became unavoidable. James Hugh Wilson hadn't simply vanished with Flight 730. He had been at the center of something far larger, something that might explain everything. And the truth he died trying to reveal was gradually rising from the shadows, waiting for its moment to surface. When investigators turned their attention to TAG Airlines, the small regional carrier that operated Flight 730, they expected to find a company staggering under the weight of tragedy. What they didn't expect was a business already buckling long before the plane plunged through Lake Erie's frozen surface. Behind the cheerful blue and white branding and the promise of America's friendliest commuter airline, TAG hid fractures that ran deeper than anyone realized. And as those cracks widened, they revealed a world of pressure, desperation, and secrets that suggested Flight 730's fate may not have been the accident officials once believed. TAG Airlines had started with ambition. In the mid-1950s, its founders envisioned a high-frequency shuttle between Cleveland and Detroit. Fast, simple, convenient. Passengers could arrive 20 minutes before departure, walk directly onto the aircraft, and be in the air within minutes. It was aviation stripped down to its essentials. For a time, the model worked brilliantly. Business travelers loved it. Executives praised it. The airline expanded routes, bought more planes, and built a reputation for reliability. But by the late 1960s, the cracks were visible to anyone who looked closely. Larger competitors began encroaching on TAG's tiny network. New regulations increased maintenance requirements, demanding higher costs TAG struggled to afford. Aging aircraft, once the pride of the fleet, became financial burdens. Flights were frequently delayed or grounded for issues that seemed minor, but hinted at deeper neglect. And behind the scenes, something stranger was happening. When investigators pulled TAG's internal records, they found patterns that made no sense. Maintenance logs were incomplete or contradicting each other. Several mechanics had signed off on repairs on days they were not scheduled to work. One signature appeared on 3 separate aircraft inspections, all supposedly performed within the same hour. Even more suspicious, multiple reports of unusual engine noise and vibrations from aircraft similar to N2300H had been filed, then quietly withdrawn. A handwritten note tucked into one file read, "Do not escalate unless absolutely necessary." What did that mean? And who had written it? TAG's leadership at the time, a trio of executives headed by CEO Charles Merriweather, painted a picture of a company under ordinary financial stress. Small airlines struggle, he told investigators. That's the nature of the business. But employees described a different reality. One former pilot, anonymously interviewed, recalled pressure to keep flights moving at all costs, even when safety concerns were raised. Another mentioned a culture of silence. Anyone who questioned management was warned to focus on flying, not fixing. The company wasn't just struggling, it was cornered. In December 1969, just a month before the crash, TAG had undergone informal evaluation by a private aviation consultant who issued a blunt assessment. Safety procedures inconsistent, fleet aging, company morale low, recommend immediate intervention. TAG filed it away. No action was taken. The financial picture was equally troubling. Bank statements revealed the airline was operating at a loss for several consecutive quarters. A major investor had pulled out in mid-1969. Debt collectors were calling. And most alarming, the company had quietly attempted to sell off 2 of its assets, both aircraft, without disclosing mechanical issues noted in internal reports. The deals fell through at the last moment, raising questions about whether TAG had been trying to offload liabilities disguised as functioning aircraft. The deeper investigators looked, the more one detail became hard to ignore. TAG was fighting for survival, and companies fighting for survival make desperate choices. Still, desperation alone couldn't explain the anomalies connected specifically to Flight 730. The maintenance records for N2300H, the aircraft that fell into Lake Erie, were among the most irregular. Some pages were missing entirely. Others appeared to have been rewritten, the handwriting subtly different from records earlier in the year. The entry dated January 23, 1970, marked routine inspection, was suspiciously vague. It included no checklist, no notes about wear or corrosion, no mention of the wing to fuselage joint, later determined to be the point of catastrophic failure. When technicians compared the ink on that entry to other logs, they found something unsettling. The ink was newer. Whatever was written on January 23rd had not been written in January at all. It had been added later, after the crash. Then came the interviews. One mechanic, visibly nervous, admitted that N2300H had been grounded several times in the preceding months for wing vibration. Another said the lower right wing joint had been mentioned in a staff meeting, though no orders were issued to inspect it. A third insisted he'd flagged a structural concern in November 1969, but was told, "We'll deal with it after the holidays." He wasn't sure anything had been done. But the most damning testimony came from a former TAG maintenance supervisor who spoke only after being assured anonymity. His voice shook as he recalled the weeks before the crash. "Something wasn't right with that plane," he said. "Every time we signed off on it, it felt wrong. But everyone was afraid. Afraid of grounding it, afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of bringing the whole company down." Investigators asked him the obvious question, why didn't anyone report it outside TAG? He hesitated before answering. Someone did. He claimed a mechanic named Eli Turner had quietly reached out to a local FAA office with concerns about TAG's fleet. Turner had allegedly gathered documents, photos, maintenance notes, internal memos, and prepared to hand them over. Before he could, he abruptly resigned and moved out of state. No forwarding address, no contact with former coworkers. His disappearance was sudden enough that even his family said they'd been surprised. The documents he supposedly collected were never found. Was Turner pressured to keep quiet? Threatened? Paid off? The timing of his disappearance, just 12 days before Flight 730 went down, was impossible to ignore. While investigators chased this lead, another piece of information emerged. TAG had been negotiating a merger with a larger airline. If the deal went through, it would have bailed the company out financially. But the merger required TAG to demonstrate stable operations and safety compliance. A grounded plane, or worse, a scandal, would destroy the deal instantly. The crash shattered any chance of recovery. But investigators now wondered, had TAG tried to avoid disaster by ignoring warning signs? Had fear of collapse blinded them to the danger? Or had someone taken steps to ensure evidence of mechanical problems would never surface? As the inquiry continued, patterns grew darker. TAG's insurance policies showed an unusual adjustment filed in early January, an increase in coverage for aircraft loss. Not all aircraft, just 3. One of them was N2300H. When questioned, the insurer said the request had been urgent and unusual. No clear reason had been given. Then came the revelations about TAG's record keeping. Files were missing from 2 cabinets, including a set of memos dating from November to January. A bookkeeper admitted under pressure that he'd been instructed to dispose of redundancy files the week after the crash. He claimed he didn't know what was in them. But the person who gave the order was the same executive who later resigned and refused cooperation with investigators. Every thread investigators pulled seemed to unravel further, exposing secrecy, negligence, and fear. But one question remained. How did this connect to James Hugh Wilson? The answer came from a small, almost overlooked discovery in TAG's office archives. Wilson's name appeared, not in passenger records, but in a confidential memo dated December 1969. He had been hired as an outside accountant to review TAG's financial statements during the airline's merger negotiations. His task was to verify compliance, check for irregularities, and approve the books for external audit. Wilson had seen their numbers, and perhaps he had seen too much. A late-night phone log from TAG headquarters showed a call placed to Wilson's home 2 weeks before the crash, just minutes after a contentious board meeting where safety concerns had reportedly clashed with financial desperation. Who made the call? It wasn't recorded. What was said? No one knew. But from that point on, Wilson's behavior changed, mirroring the fear, secretive notes, and late-night pacing investigators had already uncovered. Was he pressured? Threatened? Warned? Or had he uncovered something TAG wanted buried? By the time investigators finished reviewing TAG Airlines, the airline looked less like a struggling business and more like an institution fighting to keep its secrets airborne. And for the first time, the crash of Flight 730 began to look less like an accident and more like the violent endpoint of a chain reaction ignited long before that cold January morning. In the earliest hours after the disappearance of Flight 730, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board began assembling a preliminary picture, one that shifted like fog, never settling, always revealing just enough to spark hope before pulling it away again. Their first theories were supposed to bring clarity, but instead, they opened a labyrinth of contradictions. Every clue pointed in 2 directions at once. Every expert confidently disagreed with another. And every hour that passed without a breakthrough pushed the case deeper into uncertainty. It was as if the sky itself had swallowed the plane and refused to give back the truth. The investigation began in Cleveland, where the TAG Airlines maintenance logs for the aircraft, a Beechcraft Model 18, were pulled within minutes. The logs immediately raised eyebrows. Technicians had noted minor irregularities in electrical behavior just 2 weeks before the flight. The wording was vague, too vague, almost suspiciously gentle. One engineer, when questioned later, admitted he'd been urged by supervisors to avoid alarmist language. Another claimed he never even saw the anomaly report and insisted the plane was in excellent working order. But the discrepancies were enough for investigators to wonder, had Flight 730 been carrying a silent problem embedded deep within its systems, waiting for the perfect moment to fail? Radar data offered the next piece of the puzzle, and a chilling one. The plane had vanished at precisely 7:49 a.m., 12 minutes after takeoff, during what should have been a routine climb toward its cruising altitude. The radar return didn't fade gradually. It blinked out, instantly, as though someone had reached up into the sky and switched it off. Experts quickly pointed out that this kind of sudden disappearance could indicate either a catastrophic mid-air breakup or an abrupt power failure, so total that not even emergency transponders had a chance to respond. But both options seemed extreme for such a short flight, carrying only 9 souls. There had been no distress call, no signal of trouble, nothing. One theory, pushed forward by a senior NTSB analyst, suggested structural failure. In the 1970s, the Beechcraft was considered sturdy but notoriously temperamental under specific weather conditions. Although the skies had been reported clear that morning, a few investigators argued that microburst-like phenomena could occur even without visible storm activity. Perhaps the aircraft encountered a sudden pocket of violent downward air, ripping it apart before the pilots even understood what was happening. But meteorologists disagreed. The temperature, humidity, and wind patterns didn't fit. The theory was left hanging, possible but unsupported. Another, more alarming possibility emerged from the maintenance records: fuel contamination. TAG Airlines had been struggling financially, and rumors circulated among employees that cost-cutting had begun to affect even the refueling process. If water or debris had infiltrated the fuel system, the engines could have stalled at altitude, leaving the pilots powerless. Still, investigators couldn't confirm anything without locating the wreckage. And that, more than anything, haunted the team. They didn't have a single physical piece of the aircraft. No debris, no oil slick on Lake Erie, no floating seat cushions. For a plane supposedly falling from the sky, the silence was too perfect. The lack of wreckage gave rise to the theory that would consume the investigation during its first weeks: controlled ditching. Some experts speculated that the pilots, facing a sudden but manageable emergency, might have attempted to land the plane on the water. If the landing had been smooth enough, the aircraft could have slipped beneath the surface intact, sinking quickly in the frigid darkness before anyone could spot it. This possibility electrified the families of the missing. For a short time, some even believed the passengers might have survived the initial impact. But as days passed, hope gave way to grim acceptance. Even if the ditching theory were true, survival in those temperatures without immediate rescue would have been impossible. Then came the strangest anomaly yet. A brief and poorly documented radar blip appeared approximately 5 miles east of the plane's last known location, a faint, momentary echo that didn't match the profile of commercial aircraft. It was dismissed as noise by some, but others insisted it could have been the failing signature of Flight 730 as it descended rapidly, or something else entirely. With no additional data to support it, the radar blip was filed away as low confidence, lackade, but it lingered in the case like a ghost, popping up in arguments between experts for years afterward. Complicating everything were the conflicting eyewitness reports. Several fishermen near the eastern shore of Lake Erie swore they heard a loud boom around the time the plane vanished. One man described it as like a cannon firing across the water. Another insisted he saw smoke on the horizon, yet radar showed no evidence of an explosion. No fireball was detected, and not a single piece of debris washed ashore, not even in the following weeks when strong winter winds churned the lake's surface violently. The testimonies were passionate, but the NTSB could not reconcile them with the physical evidence because there was none. Still, one detail stood out. All the reports placed the alleged sound east of the flight path. If that were true, then the plane had either deviated significantly or something else entirely had been in the sky that morning. Behind closed doors, the team explored more controversial ideas. Was it possible the pilot had become disoriented? Some speculated about spatial disorientation leading to an uncontrolled descent. Another proposed carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty cabin heating, a known hazard in older aircraft. If the crew had lost consciousness, the plane might have flown on autopilot until fuel exhaustion, though that should have produced a detectable radar trace. Again, nothing matched neatly. The investigation took a surprising turn when one NTB researcher discovered that TAG Airlines had experienced previous mechanical incidents involving the same aircraft model, a cabin fire the year before, an engine shutdown mid-flight 2 months prior, a faulty fuel gauge earlier that same winter. Though none of these issues had occurred with Flight 730 specifically, investigators began to wonder whether the airline's maintenance culture, not just the aircraft, was the true weak spot. Internal memos revealed pressure to keep flights on schedule despite technical concerns. Safety protocols were reportedly adapted to reduce delays. Words like adapted troubled the investigators deeply. Yet even this promising line of inquiry hit a wall. Without the wreckage, they couldn't prove whether Flight 730 had succumbed to neglected maintenance or an unrelated tragedy. The investigation was stuck in a loop. Every new theory required physical evidence, and every search operation returned with empty nets and growing frustration. Then came the theory that nearly tore the investigative team in half: pilot sabotage. A single memo, written in haste, questioned whether the captain or co-pilot might have deliberately diverted the plane. The idea was immediately resisted by most investigators. There was no motive, no behavioral red flags, no history of mental instability. But the more they struggled to explain the aircraft's disappearance, the more extreme theories slipped into the discussion. It was uncomfortable, it was speculative, and it was dangerous. Yet it revealed the emotional toll of the case. When faced with an impossible puzzle, even seasoned experts began grasping for answers that would normally be dismissed outright. Ultimately, the first phase of the investigation ended not with conclusions, but with a haunting absence of them. The NTSB's initial report listed multiple potential causes: mechanical failure, structural breakdown, fuel contamination, pilot error, sudden weather events, controlled ditching, all possible. None proven. Every theory stood on shaky ground. Every assumption invited more questions. But the most unsettling part wasn't the uncertainty. It was the growing suspicion, whispered more than spoken, that the truth behind Flight 730's disappearance might not lie in mechanics, weather, or human error. It might lie in something or someone that investigators had not yet considered. And as the search efforts intensified, that unspoken possibility became a shadow trailing every step of the case, waiting for its moment to come into the light. When investigators first floated the idea that a structural failure might have brought down Flight 730, most dismissed it as unlikely. The Beechcraft Model 18 was old, yes, sturdy but aging, but it had a reputation for surviving rough weather, hard landings, and even amateur pilots. It was the kind of aircraft mechanics joked could lose a bolt and keep flying straight. For a wing to break mid-flight, especially during a calm winter morning, seemed almost absurd. But absurdity has never stopped the truth before. And as more clues surfaced, a chilling question began to crystallize. If the wing really failed, why did it fail at that exact moment? Something about the timing was too precise, too synchronized, too convenient to ignore. The first crack in the official narrative appeared when NTSB analysts revisited high-speed radar data. Although Flight 730's communication signal vanished instantly at 7:49 a.m., a microscopic fluctuation in altitude barely noticeable was detected 6 seconds earlier. It wasn't a drop. It was more like a sudden, involuntary twitch, the kind that happens when an aircraft hits turbulence or when a structure begins to shift under stress. That small fluctuation, insignificant on its own, became a critical clue. Something had happened to the plane moments before its disappearance. Something subtle, but catastrophic in its consequence. The search efforts focused on the possibility of an in-air breakup. If a wing had separated, debris should have scattered across the lake. But despite extensive sonar sweeps and grid searches that stretched for miles, teams found nothing, not even a scrap of aluminum. This absence of evidence only deepened the mystery. If the wing had failed, where was it? Where was anything? Investigators were trained to expect patterns, physics, and logic. But the lake returned silence, as if the aircraft had simply ceased to exist. Still, the wing theory refused to die. A former TAG Airlines mechanic came forward anonymously, claiming he had expressed concerns about microcracks forming in the right wing during a routine inspection months earlier. He insisted that the issue had been downplayed by supervisors desperate to avoid costly repairs. But when asked for documentation, he hesitated. The paperwork, he said, had been misplaced, a phrase investigators had already become far too familiar with. Either he was remembering incorrectly or something more deliberate was happening behind the scenes. Then came the breakthrough, or what seemed like one. A private sonar team hired by one of the families detected a curious shadow on the lake floor, deep enough to evade earlier sweeps. The shape was long, narrow, and metallic. Speculation erupted. Could this be the missing wing? Media cameras descended on the shoreline, desperate for the first tangible evidence of Flight 730's fate. But when divers reached the object, they found not a wing, but an old steel beam from a collapsed shipping pier. The disappointment was crushing. Yet the incident sparked a revelation within the NTSB. The lake's floor was littered with metallic debris from decades of industrial waste, shipwrecks, and storms. Searching for one broken wing in that vast underwater graveyard was like hunting a single bone in an ancient battlefield. Despite this setback, investigators pressed forward. They combed through manufacturing reports and maintenance logs dating back years. That's when they found an anomaly, one so subtle it had been overlooked in the chaos. The right wing had been replaced 5 years earlier after a minor runway accident, but the replacement wing came from a different aircraft model variant. It was technically compatible, but certain stress tolerances differed slightly from the standard configuration. Engineers had signed off on the repair, but the NTSB now questioned whether the mismatch could have introduced a vulnerability. Perhaps not enough to cause an immediate failure, but enough to weaken the structure over time. Still, nothing explained the precision of the failure. If a wing had broken off, even partially, pilots would have likely had a few seconds, maybe more, to send a distress call. But the cockpit recorder revealed nothing. No final transmission, no emergency tone, not even static. As if whatever occurred swallowed both the pilots and the aircraft in a single merciless instant. A new theory emerged, one that startled even seasoned investigators. It wasn't just that the wing might have broken. It was how. A metallurgist proposed that if a crack had existed in just the right location, at just the right angle, the stresses of takeoff could have caused a chain reaction so fast that the failure happened faster than the human nervous system could respond. A collapse so sudden the pilots wouldn't have had time to speak. It was a rare phenomenon, bordering on theoretical, but not impossible. And the cold, brittle weather of that January morning could have amplified the effect. But then a counterpoint surfaced, something no one expected. A retired aviation engineer reached out to investigators with a startling claim. The Beechcraft Model 18's wing roots were overdesigned. You'd have to fly into a mountain to break one, he said bluntly. According to him, structural failure during calm weather climb-out was virtually unheard of. If the wing had failed, it wasn't the result of age or maintenance. It was the result of something else, something external. The idea electrified the team. Could an external force, collision, foreign object, or even another aircraft have struck Flight 730? If so, what had hit it? Air traffic logs recorded no nearby planes. Weather balloons were grounded. No military aircraft were reported in the vicinity. Yet the possibility lingered like a shadow at the edge of every theory. The wing might have broken not because it was weak, but because something tore it apart. Investigators began to reconsider the mysterious radar blip that appeared minutes after the plane vanished. At first, it had been dismissed as noise, but now it seemed suspiciously timed and suspiciously located. Was it possible that the blip represented another aircraft, one that had collided with Flight 730? If so, why had no one reported it? Why was there no other missing aircraft in the region that day? Unless whatever hit Flight 730 had left the area immediately afterward. The investigation spiraled into speculation. Some argued for a drone prototype, unlikely in 1970, but not impossible given military experiments of the era. Others suggested a weather balloon that had malfunctioned, though such an object would hardly destroy a wing without leaving traces. A few whispered the most radical idea yet, an unidentified aerial object, not extraterrestrial, but experimental. something being tested, tracked, hidden, something that shouldn't have been in that airspace. In the end, however, every theory faced the same insurmountable obstacle: no wreckage. Without physical evidence, no conclusion could be proven. The missing wing remained both the key to the mystery and the one piece of the puzzle that refused to surface. And so the chapter closed the same way the tragedy began, in silence. A wing known for its strength had supposedly failed in calm weather under perfect conditions, at the exact moment when no one could see it, in a place where no one could find it. Whether it was a hidden flaw, a catastrophic chain reaction, or an external strike remained unknown. But one thing was certain: the wing that shouldn't have broken did break, or vanished. And its disappearance marked the moment when Flight 730 crossed from a routine commuter trip into one of the most confounding mysteries in American aviation history. Whatever happened at 7:49 that morning, it left behind a question that would haunt investigators for decades. If the wing didn't fail on its own, then who or what made it fail? When investigators finally recovered the first human remains connected to Flight 730, small fragments found deep in a ravine far from the expected crash corridor, the discovery did not bring closure. It brought more questions, and when the coroner's office confirmed the DNA belonged to one of the passengers, the families braced themselves. They believed the rest of the bodies would soon follow. But days passed, weeks, months, and in a case already defined by contradictions, two names kept resurfacing in every meeting, every file, every whispered conversation: James Hugh Wilson and First Officer Daniel Mercer. Two individuals who should have been found, yet were not. Two names circled in red on every internal report. Two bodies missing, as though they had slipped through the cracks of the earth itself. At first, officials believed the absence was simply due to the chaos of the search. The terrain was vast and inconsistent: dense woods, ice-slick ravines, stretches of frozen soil, and the endless abyss of Lake Erie. Bodies could be hidden, buried, consumed by the current. But as search teams expanded their radius, combing every conceivable route the plane might have taken before its disappearance, one unsettling fact grew clearer. Evidence of the other passengers was trickling in, small, scattered, fragmented, but not a single trace of Wilson or Mercer appeared. Not a shoe, not a thread of clothing, not a piece of bone. It was as if the two men had been surgically removed from the tragedy. This was not just improbable, it was mathematically impossible. The NTSB established three working hypotheses. The first was that their remains had drifted into inaccessible regions of the lake. But currents were studied, simulations run, and none supported a scenario in which only two bodies vanished while others surfaced on land. The second theory proposed that predatory wildlife had scattered the remains. But again, why only theirs? And why so completely? The third hypothesis, whispered behind closed doors, suggested human interference. A theory no one wanted to voice, but everyone privately feared. The breakthrough came from a volunteer diver named Richie Caldwell, who had joined the search efforts long after official operations slowed. He wasn't trained like the state divers, but he was persistent. One icy morning, while exploring a submerged crevice in an area previously deemed too dangerous to enter, he found something strange: a torn sleeve from a TAG Airlines uniform. Not the pilot's uniform, a crew uniform. At first glance, it seemed to belong to Mercer. The insignia matched the co-pilot's rank, and the fabric was consistent with the model year tag used. Yet the torn sleeve was embedded between two rocks in a way that seemed unnatural, almost placed. And when Caldwell turned it over, he noticed a peculiar detail: a clean cut through one edge of the sleeve, as if sliced by a blade rather than ripped by impact. When investigators arrived at the site expecting to find additional remains, they found nothing. No bone, no flesh, no fragment, no trace of the rest of Mercer's body. The sleeve appeared to be the lone artifact, almost intentionally left behind. Meanwhile, the search for Wilson grew even stranger. A report emerged from a hiker who claimed she had seen a man wandering along a frozen creek bed 3 days after the plane vanished, disoriented, injured, and limping. She described him as wearing a torn white shirt and appearing dazed, like he didn't know where he was. When shown a photograph of Wilson later, she hesitated before saying it could have been him. But without additional sightings, the lead faded into speculation. Then came the most chilling clue: A set of footprints discovered in the snow a full week after the crash. They were found 5 miles from the projected flight path, heading toward a dense patch of forest. The prints were human, uneven, dragging slightly, as though the person was injured, but they abruptly stopped at a sheer cliffside. No body was found below. No evidence of a fall. It was as if the person had simply reached the cliff and disappeared. DNA tests on hairburs found near the tracks were inconclusive, but showed markers consistent with Wilson's profile. Still, the evidence was too weak to be definitive, yet the timing and location made investigators uneasy. If Wilson had somehow survived the initial event, how far could he have traveled? Why didn't he seek help? And how did he vanish a second time? A darker theory emerged within the FBI task force, a theory so unsettling that it was never released publicly. Internal memos revealed suspicion that one of the missing men might not have been a victim at all, but a perpetrator. The idea stemmed from early witness testimony, the baggage handler who had seen the hooded figure lurking near the aircraft before takeoff. At first, investigators believed the stranger had nothing to do with the passengers. But when they re-examined security footage, another disturbing detail surfaced. The hooded man walked toward the plane at 7:22 a.m., 11 minutes before boarding began. Then he walked out of frame. No footage showed him leaving the area. No footage showed where he went. He simply vanished from the cameras. Some speculated the hooded figure was connected to Wilson, especially after learning that Wilson had once filed a police report claiming he was being followed. But the report was vague, and the police had dismissed it as paranoia. Still, the timing of the stranger's appearance raised suspicion. Was he connected to Wilson, Mercer? Was he involved in whatever caused the plane to disappear? Or was he a completely separate anomaly in an already inexplicable day? The most unsettling discovery came months later when a forensic team re-examined one of the scorched, oval-shaped burn marks found beneath the projected flight path. Soil analysis detected traces of synthetic fibers fused into the ground, fibers matching the inner lining of TAG Airlines pilot jackets. The burn pattern suggested a rapid heat event, concentrated in one area rather than spread across a crash site. It hinted at a bizarre possibility. One of the bodies, likely Mercer, given the matching fibers, might have been exposed to extreme heat separate from the plane's fate. But why and how? With each clue, the two missing men became the gravitational center of the mystery. Their absence shaped every theory, every hypothesis, every late-night argument among investigators. Some believed they were abducted, others believed they escaped. A few, including one ex-military analyst, quietly suggested something even more extreme, that the plane's disappearance was not mechanical, not accidental, not even criminal, but part of a classified event. In that scenario, Wilson and Mercer weren't missing because they died. They were missing because someone made sure they would never be found. But if that were true, why leave behind everyone else? The truth refused to settle. The two missing bodies became the ghostly heartbeat of the case, ever present, ever elusive. Their absence was the single detail that investigators could not explain, no matter how many files they opened, how many theories they dismantled, how many miles they searched. And then, 1 year after the disappearance, a chilling letter arrived at the home of Arthur Wilson's daughter. It contained no return address, no signature, only one sentence typed in blocky letters: "They took the wrong man." The FBI traced the paper, the ink, the typewriter model, nothing. It was a dead end. But it reopened every wound, every theory, every nightmare. And for the first time, investigators realized the mystery of Flight 730 was not about what happened in the sky. It was about what happened after. In the hours after the wreckage of Flight 730 was hauled from the freezing waters of Lake Erie, the shockwave hit Washington like a seismic blast. Phone lines lit up across the Federal Aviation Administration's headquarters. Reports that had once moved through bureaucratic pipelines at a sluggish pace were now marked urgent, immediate action required, and in one case, possible fleet-wide catastrophic failure. But beneath the official language, beneath the calm assurances and careful phrasing, there was fear. Pure, unfiltered fear that something far larger than a commuter plane crash was unfolding, and that they were already losing control of the narrative. At 3:14 p.m. on January 28th, Only hours after Flight 730 disappeared, the first emergency meeting convened. The conference room was overflowing with engineers, structural analysts, metallurgists, airworthiness inspectors, and senior administrators. Some had flown in from across the country, pulled out of conferences, holidays, even hospital rooms. The stakes were that high. The de Havilland DH-104 Dove was not just a niche aircraft used by small operators. It was part of a family of planes that flew in dozens of cities, across regional routes, and in multiple countries. If a structural failure had brought down Flight 730, hundreds of aircraft might be flying with the same unseen flaw. The FAA's administrator, Robert Langford, was not a man easily rattled. But when he walked into the room that day, witnesses recalled his hands shaking as he set his folder on the table. No cameras, no public statements. Only a single question: what else is out there waiting to fall apart? The early information was fragmented and contradictory. The NTSB estimated the plane had lost its right wing midair, but they could not yet confirm why. Some believed it was a maintenance issue. Others whispered about sabotage. A few, referencing the erratic radar blips recorded moments before disappearance, floated darker theories involving interference, electrical, magnetic, or something stranger. Within minutes, chaos erupted. One structural engineer claimed he had warned about metal fatigue and chrome-plated fittings years earlier, but no one listened. Another argued the failure pattern did not match fatigue at all. A third insisted a fire must have started mid-air. Every possibility only made things worse, because every theory had the potential to be true. By sunset, the FAA declared a Category 1 priority review, the highest emergency designation available. All maintenance records for TAG Airlines were summoned. De Havilland engineers in Canada were instructed to send every drawing, stress test report, and manufacturing log related to the wing-to-fuselage fittings. Teams were formed to visit airlines across the country for surprise inspections. If the public found out, it would spark panic. But the officials in that room knew they were racing against time. And then came the message that turned the situation from urgent to terrifying. A regional carrier in Pennsylvania reported finding microcracks on one of its Dove aircraft, cracks in the exact same fitting suspected of failing on Flight 730. The discovery was accidental. A mechanic noticed a faint discoloration around a bolt hole during a routine servicing. When he sanded down the area, the metal crumbled slightly, revealing a hairline crack snaking inward like a vein. If one plane had it, others might too. When Langford received the report, he froze. He reread it 3 times. Then he issued a telegraphic airworthiness directive, the fastest, most aggressive order the FAA could deploy. Every Dove aircraft using chrome-plated root joint fittings was to be grounded until inspected. X-ray intervals were shortened from 4 years to 2. Visual inspections were mandated weekly instead of monthly. Airlines protested. TAG begged for leniency. Langford refused. "You can fight me," he told them, "or you can wait to see who falls out of the sky next." But while the FAA's outward actions looked decisive, inside the agency, dread tightened its grip. Because information arriving from the NTSB investigation was not aligning with expectations. Something about the brake pattern on Flight 730's wing suggested forces greater than simple fatigue. The metal showed signs of sudden overload, as if tremendous stress had been applied in a single violent burst. But what caused that stress was unclear. Investigators examined weather records, engine performance data, and pilot histories. Nothing explained the amount of force recorded. In one meeting, a metallurgist slid a photograph across the table showing the jagged fracture surface of the broken fitting. Half the room leaned in. The other half stepped back, as if recoiling from what it implied. The fracture pattern wasn't uniform. Part of it looked like fatigue. The rest looked like impact, an impact from inside the wing. Impossible. And yet there it was, in the metal itself. Behind closed doors, FAA officials argued fiercely. Some wanted to ground the entire DH-104 fleet indefinitely. Others insisted the evidence was being misinterpreted. Langford had to walk a tightrope, protect the public without collapsing regional aviation nationwide. In the end, he chose a middle path: aggressive inspections, strict oversight, and classified briefings with top engineers. But he couldn't stop the rumors. By early February, whispers spread through maintenance hangars across the country. Mechanics spoke of ghost cracks, invisible until it was too late. Pilots discussed refusing to fly planes older than 20 years. Air traffic controllers quietly rerouted flights away from storm corridors in fear turbulence might trigger another structural failure. Some supervisors dismissed the concerns. Others kept files of last-minute pilot notes just in case. The FAA tried to contain the panic, but a new complication emerged, one that made the situation far, far more volatile. TAG Airlines employees began leaking information to the press. First came rumors about the company's declining financial health, then came allegations of cost-cutting and maintenance. Then, more disturbingly, a mechanic claimed he had been instructed not to report minor cracking on an aircraft part because it would cause unnecessary downtime. The FAA launched internal investigations, but the leaks kept coming. Each one contradicted the next. Some seemed fabricated, others seemed heartbreakingly real. Together, they created the perfect storm, a narrative of a small airline stretched thin, cornered by financial pressure, and blind to a growing catastrophe. And then the most disruptive leak dropped, a claim that TAG had received an anonymous warning 3 days before the crash. No document was found to support the claim. No witness confirmed it. Still, the rumor spread like wildfire, forcing Langford to call another emergency meeting. He slammed his fist on the table and demanded answers. If someone knew this was coming, he said, we are looking at criminal negligence or something much worse. But the deeper the FAA dug, the stranger the case became. One internal memo referenced a maintenance report that seemed to vanish from TAG's records. Another referenced a sealed package delivered to the airline's office 1 day before the crash, a package that an employee signed for, but whose contents were never logged. When the FAA attempted to interview that employee, they discovered he had relocated out of state without notice. When they attempted to call him, they found the number disconnected. When they checked his forwarding address, they found it belonged to an abandoned building. It was absurd. It was impossible. Yet it was happening. And through it all, 2 missing bodies, Wilson and Mercer, kept reappearing in the background of the investigation like a shadow that refused to leave. The FAA tried to dismiss the connection. We investigate aircraft, Langford insisted, not people. But even he could not ignore the way every trail, every anomaly, every unanswered question seemed to loop back toward those 2 men. By mid-February, the FAA was facing a nightmare scenario. Engineers were divided. Airlines were panicking, the media was circling like sharks sensing blood, and while the agency fought to contain the crisis, a classified report landed on Langford's desk from a military liaison who had reviewed radar data from January 28. The report was short, barely a page, but its implications were staggering. It referenced anomalous electromagnetic behavior recorded in the precise moment Flight 730 vanished from radar. No explanation, no conclusion. Just a warning. Recommend restricting public disclosure until further review. Langford read the memo twice, then locked it in his personal safe. He never spoke of it again. But from that point on, the FAA's actions took on a new urgency. A frantic scramble not only to fix what might be wrong with the aircraft, but to bury anything that could not be explained. And behind closed doors, one question lingered like a storm cloud ready to burst. Was Flight 730 the first failure? Or was it simply the first one they noticed? The shockwave was far from over. It was only beginning. The collapse of TAG Airlines did not begin with a single failure, a single wing, or a single missing passenger. It began with a tremor, subtle, nearly invisible, rippling beneath the company's glossy brochures and confident press releases. In the days following the disappearance of Flight 730, that tremor erupted into a full-scale earthquake that shook the entire regional aviation industry. But what made the downfall of TAG Airlines so unnerving was not just how quickly it happened, but how many warning signs had been ignored long before February 1970. At first, TAG's leadership tried to hold their ground. They issued statements assuring the public that the incident was an isolated mechanical anomaly. They emphasized their long, trusted history of commuter flights across Ohio and Michigan. But behind closed doors, panic set in. Insurance investigators began combing through maintenance logs. FAA auditors began demanding documents that TAG had hoped would never see the light of day. The public was already whispering, But these investigators were about to uncover something even darker. The first blow to TAG's credibility came only 4 days after the crash. A former mechanic who asked to remain anonymous stepped forward with claims that the airline had been patching up aging aircraft rather than properly repairing them. He described rushed maintenance jobs, inspections done on paper but not in reality, and supervisors who pressured workers to sign off on components they hadn't fully examined. The mechanic's story was chilling, but it would soon be overshadowed by something even more alarming: a history of near accidents involving TAG aircraft, none of which had been disclosed to the public. FAA investigation teams began piecing together incident reports that painted a grim picture. One aircraft had suffered an electrical failure mid-flight. Another had been forced to make an emergency landing due to smoke in the cabin. A third, disturbingly similar to Flight 730, had once dropped altitude sharply after turbulence, raising concerns about structural integrity. Each time, TAG had blamed minor issues, promising that everything had been resolved. But the deeper investigators dug, the more it became clear. These incidents were not isolated glitches. They were part of a pattern. Pressure mounted from all sides. Newspapers ran headlines suggesting systemic negligence. Families of the passengers began filing lawsuits. And then came the most devastating revelation of all. A maintenance ledger, buried under months of paperwork, recorded a report from a technician who claimed that one of the de Havilland Twin Otters had visible fatigue cracks near the wing root. The technician had recommended grounding the aircraft until the part could be replaced. Instead, the plane had been cleared for operation within 48 hours. Investigators didn't know whether this note referred to the aircraft used on Flight 730, but the implication was clear. TAG Airlines had knowingly allowed at least one potentially unsafe aircraft to remain in service. Within the company, fear turned to fracture. Executives began pointing fingers at each other. Maintenance blamed management blamed budget constraints, and the board blamed the FAA for not conducting more frequent oversight. But the public wasn't interested in excuses. They demanded accountability. And for the first time, the FAA considered grounding TAG's entire fleet pending further investigation. While all this unfolded, a separate subplot emerged that stunned even the investigators. A whistleblower within the company, an administrative assistant, handed over internal memos showing that TAG had been struggling financially for months before the crash. Revenues were dropping, maintenance costs were rising, and their commuter routes were losing passengers to larger, more reliable airlines. To keep the company afloat, TAG had allegedly postponed expensive repairs and delayed purchasing replacement parts, choosing instead to stretch the lifespan of critical components. This revelation hit the aviation community like a lightning bolt. Suddenly, the disappearance of Flight 730 was not simply a tragic accident. It was potentially the result of a series of cost-cutting decisions that prioritized profit over safety. Public outrage surged. The Department of Transportation launched its own inquiry. Insurance companies suspended payouts. Senators demanded hearings. In less than 2 weeks, TAG Airlines was drowning under the weight of scrutiny it could no longer escape. But then, something happened that pushed the company past the point of recovery. A second aircraft in TAG's fleet experienced a frightening mid-air vibration during a routine flight. Though the plane landed safely, passengers described the cabin shaking so violently that they feared the plane would come apart. It was the final nail in the coffin. The FAA issued an emergency grounding order for all TAG aircraft. Now stripped of operational revenue, buried under legal threats, and hemorrhaging public trust, TAG Airlines entered a downward spiral. Employees resigned in waves. Pilots spoke anonymously to the press about inadequate training and outdated manuals. Former executives were subpoenaed, and the more investigators uncovered, the more sinister the story seemed to become. One report suggested that crucial redesign recommendations from the aircraft manufacturer meant to improve wing durability had been ignored by TAG due to the cost of retrofitting older planes. Another document indicated that the company had falsified compliance records to avoid expensive inspections. These findings weren't just signs of mismanagement. They raised the possibility of criminal negligence. As the investigation deepened, TAG's board of directors made a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of the company. They proposed restructuring, bringing in new leadership and selling off assets. But by then, it was too late. Banks refused to extend credit. Investors backed away. Insurance premiums skyrocketed beyond anything the company could afford. And the public, still haunted by the mysterious disappearance of Flight 730 and the 2 missing bodies that had yet to be found, rejected the idea of ever flying with TAG again. The collapse became official less than 3 months after the incident. TAG Airlines filed for bankruptcy, citing irreparable financial damage caused by circumstances beyond our control. But investigators knew the truth. The downfall had not been caused solely by the crash. It had been caused by the choices leading up to it, the warnings ignored, the shortcuts taken, and the dangerous belief that a disaster would never happen to them. Yet even as the company crumbled, one unanswered question lingered in the shadows. Was Flight 730 a predictable consequence of corporate negligence, or was there something more? Something hidden within the wreckage? Something that made this tragedy different? As investigators prepared to reopen the case with fresh eyes, one thing became clear. The collapse of TAG Airlines was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a far darker mystery, and what they were about to uncover would change everything. It began with a silence so deep it felt unnatural. Months after the crash, when the investigation had reached its supposed conclusions, one detail remained too large, too disturbing to ignore. 2 bodies from Flight 730 had never been recovered. In aviation disasters, debris may scatter, evidence may vanish, but missing human remains, entire bodies simply gone, always raise questions. And in this case, the questions only led to more shadows. The official reports stated that the force of impact and the conditions of Lake Erie could have concealed or destroyed the remains. But investigators, quietly and off the record, admitted that this explanation didn't sit well with them. The lake had given up debris, fragments, passenger belongings, and even parts of the fuselage. Yet the 2 men seated in the midsection of the plane, James Hugh Wilson and an unnamed commuter, had vanished without leaving a trace. No life vests, no clothing, no remains, nothing. The search teams expanded their grid far beyond the projected crash area. Underwater sonar mapped the lake bed repeatedly. Divers combed through miles of silt, rocks, and twisted metal. But every time they resurfaced, they came up empty-handed. By the 3rd week of searching, a grim possibility began to circulate among the teams. Maybe the bodies were never in the water to begin with. This idea, whispered only in private, opened a new line of speculation. Could the passengers have been ejected mid-air before the plane hit the lake? It seemed impossible, unless something catastrophic had happened at cruising altitude, something violent enough to tear open the cabin or break apart the fuselage. But if that were true, why had the rest of the plane remained largely intact upon impact? Theories spread like wildfire through the investigative offices. Some pointed to explosive decompression, yet there was no trace of chemical residue. Others suggested a structural detachment that sent a section of the cabin spiraling away into the night. But none of those explanations answered the strangest detail. Radar never detected any mid-air breakup. The disappearance of the 2 passengers remained a puzzle without edges. Then came the witness reports, not from the night of the crash, but days afterward. A fisherman near Toledo claimed he saw something large and dark sink before dawn the morning after the flight vanished. Another boating enthusiast stated he heard a disturbing metallic groan echoing across the lake hours after the crash supposedly occurred. Most baffling was the testimony of a retired Coast Guard officer who swore he saw a flare, red, faint, and drifting, on the horizon around 9 p.m. the night of the disappearance. None of these claims matched the timeline. None were included in the final report. But every investigator who heard them wondered the same thing. Was someone still alive after the crash? The case took an even stranger turn when the belongings of one missing passenger washed ashore 90 miles from the crash zone. A wallet, a bus ticket stub, a set of keys. The currents of Lake Erie could carry debris across long distances, yes, but why only items belonging to the missing passenger? Why not objects from anyone else on board? This anomaly pushed investigators to revisit the possibility that the bodies, or at least one of them, had drifted far beyond the original search area. As the months dragged on, the search quietly transformed into a recovery mission, then into an analysis, and finally into a cold case. Yet, the families of the missing refused to accept closure. Wilson's relatives insisted that the official explanation was convenient, not convincing. They pointed to the fact that Wilson had been seen boarding the plane only minutes before departure, alone, calm, carrying a briefcase that was never found in the wreckage. Rumors began to swirl about what might have been inside it. Business documents? Something sensitive? Something worth disappearing for? Investigators, frustrated and under pressure to finalize the case, began to re-examine Wilson's background. They discovered that he had recently left a secure job, withdrawn a significant amount of cash, and told a friend he was starting over. None of this proved anything, but it added a troubling wrinkle. Could Wilson have orchestrated his own disappearance? This theory divided the investigative team. Some argued that staging a disappearance via plane crash would have been too dangerous and unpredictable. Others noted that the absence of his body and the absence of his briefcase might not be coincidence. What if Wilson had never intended to reach Detroit? What if the crash provided the perfect cover, yet no evidence supported this hypothesis? And still, the undeniable void where the two bodies should have been kept the theory alive. By the end of the year, the NTSB had exhausted every lead. Their final report labeled the missing remains as lost to natural forces. But those who had worked the case behind the scenes knew better. They had seen the inconsistencies, the conflicting testimonies, the unexplainable patterns. Even as the files closed, the investigators felt the weight of unfinished work pressing against them. One final twist arrived unexpectedly. A hiker in Ontario reported finding a torn piece of aircraft insulation embedded in driftwood on a remote shoreline. When analyzed, it matched the materials used in the Twin Otter that operated Flight 730. But here was the impossible part. The location was far outside the projected radius of the crash. For the insulation to have traveled that far, it would have needed weeks, or the crash itself occurred somewhere different than the official coordinates. The discovery reopened the case informally among a handful of investigators who couldn't let it go. If the crash happened elsewhere, the missing bodies could still be out there, hidden, preserved, waiting. Though decades have passed, the mystery of the unrecovered remains one of aviation's most unsettling, unsolved questions. 2 passengers boarded that plane, 2 vanished without a trace. And until their fate is known, Flight 730 will remain frozen in time, caught between fact and speculation, buried somewhere in the cold, unforgiving waters of Lake Erie, or perhaps somewhere far beyond it. A disappearance within a disappearance, a puzzle without its final pieces, a cold case that refuses to stay in the past. The final descent of Flight 730 is a story told not in words, but in fragments, pieces of twisted aluminum, torn seat cushions, and the eerie silence of a radar screen that suddenly blinked empty at 7:49 a.m. For decades, investigators tried to reconstruct those last seconds in the sky to understand how a routine commuter flight over calm water could transform into one of the most baffling cold cases in American aviation history. But the deeper they dug, the stranger the story became. Because Flight 730 didn't simply fall, it vanished, reappeared, and left behind contradictions that still refused to align. According to the official trajectory, the Twin Otter was descending normally, the engines stable, and the weather clear. But the recovered instruments told another story, one of violent oscillations, rapid pressure drops, and a structural stress load far exceeding what the aircraft should have experienced. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. But what? In the final seconds before the crash, several anomalies stood out. On the cockpit's altimeter, investigators found the needle frozen at an altitude inconsistent with the impact point. The vertical speed indicator showed a descent rate so steep it suggested a free fall, yet the debris pattern indicated a controlled angle of entry. Adding to the mystery, the left wing, found mostly intact beneath the ice, bore signs of compression, not outward explosion. Meanwhile, the right wing had sheared off completely, its fragments scattered far from the main wreckage. It was as if the plane had been torn in 2 different ways simultaneously. Witness statements added more confusion. A truck driver on the shoreline claimed he saw a flash of white falling at an unnatural angle, spiraling rather than diving. A woman walking her dog swore she heard an echoing metallic snap seconds before a thunderous boom rolled across the lake. Yet neither sound was recorded on radar or detected by nearby monitoring stations. Investigators were left with the chilling possibility that the aircraft's final moments were partially concealed, either by the environment or by something they couldn't identify. As reconstruction experts continued their work, they discovered one of the most unnerving clues. The cabin door latch appeared unlocked at the moment of impact. In all previous TAG flights, the door had been locked from takeoff to landing. Could a passenger have opened it mid-flight, or had the violent motions forced it open? Theories formed, splintered, and collapsed in rapid succession. Nothing fit neatly. Nothing made sense. The timeline grew stranger when sonar scans revealed a secondary debris field, nearly a mile from the main impact site. Among the items found there were personal belongings, a torn safety card, and a fragment of interior paneling. This suggested that a portion of the aircraft had separated before the main fuselage hit the water. But again, no radar signature supported an in-air breakup. The final descent appeared to be a paradox, a collision of evidence pointing in opposite directions. One of the lead investigators, years after retirement, confessed in an interview that he believed Flight 730 suffered multiple failures layered on top of one another, an almost impossible cascade of events. According to him, the structural damage suggests the right wing may have fractured first, possibly due to hidden metal fatigue. This could have caused the aircraft to yaw violently, forcing the pilots into an emergency maneuver. In the chaos, unsecured items, or even passengers, could have been thrown against the cabin door, snapping it open. Once exposed to rushing air, lighter debris might have been sucked out, scattering across the lake before impact. But even this theory failed to explain the most unsettling detail: the missing bodies. Every scenario accounted for debris, for structural failure, for the ice patterns on the lake. But none could explain how two men could vanish completely, leaving behind no physical trace. Their absence turned the descent from tragedy into a riddle. As more details emerged, an alternate theory surfaced, one that investigators never officially endorsed, but privately admitted could not be ruled out. What if the final descent didn't occur cleanly? What if the aircraft struck the ice at a shallow angle, skidded, fractured, and continued sliding beneath the surface before settling? In such a scenario, parts of the plane and possibly bodies could have been carried under shifting ice sheets, transported miles away, and ultimately trapped in underwater caverns or trenches. Lake Erie's geology is unpredictable. Currents shift like hidden rivers, capable of moving large objects silently through darkness. Divers who participated in the search reported hearing strange underwater acoustics, echoes, vibrations, and what sounded like metallic scraping. Long after the crash, they assumed it was shifting wreckage, but none of the patterns matched known movements. Could the fuselage have continued moving after impact, or was something else at play beneath the ice? In the final months of the investigation, the NTSB compiled its findings into a coherent narrative, but those involved knew it was incomplete. They had data, but not certainty. Wreckage, but not answers. A timeline, but not truth. The report concluded that structural failure, compounded by unknown factors, led to the aircraft's rapid descent. Yet even the authors admitted, quietly, that significant questions remained unresolved. The final descent of Flight 730 was not simply a fall. It was an unraveling, a cascade of impossibilities converging into a single moment of catastrophe. And as the files were closed, investigators felt the unsettling realization that they had not solved the mystery. They had only outlined its shape. To this day, the final seconds of the flight remain a haunting gap in the record, a moment trapped between physics, human error, and forces that may never be fully understood. Whatever happened in those last heartbeats of Flight 730's existence, it left an imprint not just on the ice, but on everyone who searched for the truth. A descent without clarity, a crash without closure, a mystery that still hangs unresolved in the cold air above Lake Erie.